So as I said in my last video, I do plan on putting out a number of videos addressing the various video requests that patrons have sent me over the months. And one of them has to do with this question about the natural knowability of the Trinity. In other words, to what degree can the dogma of the Trinity be attained or hinted at by, one could say, unaided reason, independently of supernatural grace? And I think this is a crucial question, and one that I did attempt to shed some degree of light on in my past videos, where I have talked about, the Trinity and how I see it as saving us from the entailment of pantheism. But of course, I think I should have been a bit more careful and clear in that video, as there are some magisterial discrepancies that can no doubt emerge if one isn't, careful about these kinds of speculations about the Trinity. So let me reiterate a bit what the magisterium actually has to say on this issue, and then proceed to sort of elaborate on what my position actually is in light of those past videos that I just alluded to. So as per Ludwig Ott's Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, which I like to quote a lot on this channel, the notion that the Trinity can only be known through divine revelation is indeed ranked upon sententia fidei proxima, so which means it's a theological note of certainty that basically translates to being approximate to the faith, which he then goes on to clarify to mean that it's essentially a doctrine which is regarded by theologians generally as a truth of revelation, but which hasn't been, fully promulgated as such by the Church. And of course, this coheres quite nicely with what the fathers of the Church, such as Augustine, and the doctors of the Church, such as St. Thomas Aquinas, have said on this matter. That is, the mystery of the Trinity of Persons is just that, a mystery. It is a sublime revelation of the inner life of the infinite God, which by logical necessity has to elude the capacity of natural reason to attain. And ironically, it is actually a truth of natural reason that God's inner life is indeed ineffable and inaccessible to the finite intellect, unless the divine himself were to reveal his inner life to such finite intellects. Now, the reason for this is because the divine existence and attributes can only be reasoned to from created effects as to their cause, and so finite intellects can only directly grasp the negation of finite perfections, insofar as they are finite, and from this way of negation get at the existence of that which truly lacks any and all limitations or finitude. So to argue that the inner life of the divinity can be understood and grasped by the finite capacity of a created intellect would, in many ways, I think, be to undermine the very rational capacity that arrives at the existence of God in the first place, let alone the fact that, divine revelation itself insists upon the ineffability of God's inner triune life, when Christ himself says that, none knoweth the Father but the Son, and he to whom it shall please the Son to reveal him. So, if I wasn't clear in my last video, I'm definitely going to make it abundantly clear now that it is indeed not possible to prove the doctrine of the Trinity by the unaided capacity of natural reason. So what was the point of that I was trying to make in that video about how the Trinity saves us from pantheism, and how does this sort of avoid what I just laid out? Well, what I was attempting to get at does not really have to do with arriving at the Trinity itself from the standpoint of naturally discernible truths about God from the ground up. It rather has to do with analyzing certain objections which purport to derive absurd entailments from classical theism, and coming to the realization that the doctrine of the Trinity, if true, would suffice to remove any room for these purported entailments. Now notice, this is not saying that the doctrine of the Trinity is our only recourse to refuting such objections altogether in any way, but that it has within itself the explanatory power to offer an alternative explanation that can stand in place of the purported entailments that some think would maybe refute classical theism or lead to some kind of a contradiction. Now, one such objection that I tried to tackle in that last video on the topic is the following: that if God is to be considered pure actuality, and as such is to be considered necessarily and eternally active, and if God is to be considered both infinite and simple, then he must be necessarily and eternally active by one infinite and simple divine act. And if this is true, then there doesn't seem to be really anything remotely analogous to, one could say, a mediating principle that would prevent the infinitude of this divine activity from flowing into creation itself. In other words, since we know that creation exists and that it would have to be a result of God's infinite activity, then one could object that because God is radically unified as a monad, the object of this infinite self-diffusive activity would necessarily have to proceed outside of himself in the form of, say, emanations. And this sort of roughly coheres with a lot of non-Christian platonically inspired theologies. You know, that the one proceeds outward in the form of metaphysically necessary emanations which descend down the great chain of being. And while I would not submit that such a system is necessarily pantheistic per se, it certainly opens itself up to pantheistic implications, and the grounding upon which a strict transcendent monotheism stands becomes kind of shaky and philosophically insecure. So what does the Trinity have to do with contributing to this conversation? Well, one thing that the Trinity does is provide that sort of analogous mediating principle. Now, don't misinterpret me. I'm not saying that the generation of the Son from the Father in some way equates to demiurgic emanations, but what I am saying is that the generation of the Son from the Father by the Spirit does provide a means whereby God's self-diffusive intra-divine activity can actualize in its full infinitude without necessarily overflowing into the created order. The Son is the perfect consubstantial image of the Father, who shares completely in the Father's divinity and only differs from the Father by opposition of relations. So, as such, the necessarily active and infinite self-diffusion of the divine essence possesses thereby an intelligible mechanism whereby it can remain self-contained within himself. Any procession outside of himself would remain entirely free and really distinct from God himself. Now, I'm not maintaining that the specific doctrine of the Trinity as articulated in sacred scripture and in the canons is itself logically necessary to secure this, but what I am saying is that the Trinity provides an intelligible articulation of the way in which God must relate to himself within himself. Now, how God relates to himself and under what self-referential relations he does this remains hidden to the unaided created intellect, but that he must relate to himself prior to the creation of all things seems to me to be a critical position to maintain if classical theism is to be thoroughly defended on rational grounds. And so it's my contention that unaided reason by itself, while unable to articulate the precise mechanism whereby this happens in the inner life of the divinity, nevertheless the doctrine of the Trinity, once revealed, fulfills what reason can recognize as having been, up to this point, sort of a missing piece of the puzzle. So that's what I would have to say about that, and I hope that was helpful to you. I hope that it provided some clarity. If it didn't, just let me know in the comments and I'll respond. For my next patron request, there are some atheistic objections that I'm going to respond to. And then after that, I kind of want to put something out on how Catholics, I think, should be dealing with this current pontificate under Francis, because I think there's a lot of confusion and despair going around that I think could maybe use some additional thoughts. So yeah, God bless.